Thank you, John. Thank you to the GIST staff and everybody for coming out tonight. So tonight I'll be talking about habitat connectivity for the white-sided jackrabbit between the United States and Mexico. First, I'm going to introduce the white-sided jackrabbit. I'll describe its habitat, what constitutes good habitat, bad habitat. I'll also explain the methods that I used for developing a corridor model. And I'll show the landscape change from 1984 to 2014 using Landsat imagery. I'll describe how this migration corridor between the US and Mexico has changed over the last 30 years. So the goals of this study were to create a corridor model in order to determine if there was connectivity between the only United States population of the white-sided jackrabbit and connectivity between the only population that we know of in northern Chihuahua. And to compare land cover changes from 1984 to the present to see how that's affected the species. And I'll evaluate how and why the predicted migration corridor has changed from 1984 to the present. So who is the white-sided jackrabbit? So we have two species of Lepus callotis. Lepus callotis callotis, which occurs in central and southern Mexico, and they refer to it as liebre tordo down there, and liebre pinta, Lepus callotis gayardii, which is the species north of Durango, and it reaches into southwestern New Mexico in a region called the Boot Heel. The species is exclusively nocturnal, occurs in pairs most of the time, and it is grassland obligate, and this is critically important to this project because any amount of shrub cover causes an impedance to its migration. So here's a range and distribution map for the white-sided jackrabbit. And as you see in the south here with the red triangles, this is the southern species, and it has a breakpoint around the Rio Nazas in central Durango, which demarcates the two species. So we're going to be focusing on Lepus callotis gayardii in the northern area here, and you can see the study area is delineated. So the way this project started out, the first thing I did was to gather museum specimens, and these ranged from 1892 up until 1997, although we have data from New Mexico that goes up until 2011. And this is not meant to be read, but there's about 4 or 5 pages of this and 177 records that I came up with, and they are from various sources, including the Natural History Museum of the US, England, UNAM, and Mexico City, and a variety of other sources. And so these has all the appropriate data, such as elevation, when the species was collected, who collected it, description, and here's a close-up of that. And so you see the first specimen here was collected in 1892. And it just so happens that it's in our neck of the woods. And so an Army surgeon named Edgar Mearns, who was the naturalist on the U.S.-Mexico Boundary Commission survey, was the first person to collect a specimen of Lepus callotis gayardii and describe it. And he collected it near Monument 63, which is this obelisk that you see right here. If you've been down to the border, you may have encountered these. And they established these back in the days before there were fences. And they were set up in terms of line of sight. And so basically, if you were standing on one point, you should be able to see one to your right and one to the left. And that's how you know that you're on the appropriate side of the border. Right here is Cloverdale, which is not really a town. It used to be a town, but it's in the southern Animas Valley of New Mexico. And this is where the sole US population exists now. And there are 65 animals that we estimated as of 2011. It's a pretty small population. This is what the habitat looks like. So we're standing in New Mexico in the Animas Valley, and we're looking southeast towards Chihuahua at the ridge line there, and a little bit to the right is Sonora. So the two borders come there, as well as the New Mexico border right there. And that's also the Continental Divide. So any raindrop that falls on this side goes in the Pacific, the other one goes in the Atlantic. So this is perfect Lepus callotis habitat. It's shrub-free, short grass prairie. It's basically the same species assemblage that you would find in Manitoba, Canada, coming down to the Great Plains, and it delineates the historic range of the bison. And in fact, Cabeza de Vaca reported in the 1500s bison in this area, so you see a remnant of vegetation. The habitat that this is known as is called Madrean Plains grassland. And this species is pretty much exclusively tied to the Madrean grasslands. And you see that all the records occur in this darker brown color. So there's Cloverdale, the northern population, and then here's the closest, nearest population that we know of in Chihuahua, and it's outside of a town called Colonia Juarez, and the most recent record is from 1997 in this area. Everything else in between, we haven't seen in a while. So the goal is to find if a corridor exists between these two populations and if connectivity still occurs. This is what the habitat looks like down in Chihuahua near Colonia Juarez. Very much like the Animas Valley, short grass prairie, not a lot of shrub invasion, in really nice condition. However, in between, we have this. And so this is mesquite. And so mesquite has invaded the grasslands of the Southwest in the last 100 years. It's a source of huge debate and study. This is bad. We don't want this. This is not what the white-sided jackrabbit wants. So how do you go about assessing a corridor? Well, I started out with Landsat imagery. So I used 2 Landsat scenes, is what they're called, and a Landsat scene is about 185 kilometers by 170. Actually, it's not about, it is that measurement. And they're in paths and rows. Now, a path goes longitudinally, and so the Landsat satellite is circumnavigating the poles, going in, this direction, and then the rows basically follow lines of latitude, and so it's corkscrewing around the Earth, and every 16 days it covers everything. And it's been doing this since 1972. So I used Landsat 5 for 1984 and Landsat 8 for 2014. This is a false color image, which a lot of you have probably seen. If you don't know what it does, it's basically you're changing the colors so that you can see the vegetation. So the red colors that you see here, that's enhanced. You change the color guns and whatever you're viewing it in so you can get an idea of what vegetation is standing out. So you can see the farm fields and then the forests, which are on top of the mountain ridges there, which stay green all year long. Those really stand out. So you start processing this imagery and extracting NDVI values from it, smash a digital elevation model into it, and then you end up with this raster. It's more than just a pretty picture. There's a lot of data behind that. So there's millions of pixels that have elevation, aspect data, just a variety of different things, and all the spectrums from Landsat. So I calculated the NDVI using the classic formula, which you can see here, and then I reclassified this into vegetation categories which are relevant to the white-sided jackrabbit. And these are grassland, 0 to 5% shrub cover, which is like what you saw in that first picture, and then grading into 5 to 20%, and then shrub dominated, which was in the bad habitat, and then finally forest woodland, which happens to share the same signature as your agricultural fields. So you see these center pivots look very similar because there's a lot of green vegetation there. So I used an unsupervised classification, and you may ask, okay, why are you going to let your pixels run unsupervised? Well, in this area, we did not have the luxury of getting good ground control points because it's inaccessible, very remote. It's the Sierra Madre, eastern. I don't need to say anything more about that. It's really become a very sketchy area. And in 1984, we did not have high-resolution aerial imagery such as Google Earth to be able to use. So what I did is I ended up running the classification for 2014 because we do have that imagery. And I'm going to go through how you can do this. You can do some ground truthing through using Google Earth. So here's an accuracy matrix, and basically what this does is it tells you how accurate was your classification assessment that ArcGIS or AirDOS did, whichever software you used. And here's all the categories of grassland, shrubland that I explained earlier. So basically you start out with your NDVI image, which you've done the classification on. You add some random points to this. In this case I used 100. Then you can extract those classification values from the points. Now you'll see on the right-hand column there, it says raster value. And you've got these 1, 2, 3, 4 values. That corresponds to what you're seeing up here. Then you can export that back out to a KML file, which you then open in Google Earth. And so here's the classic Google Earth image. So if you look up here, it's got an object ID of 52. Look down here, there's object ID 52. So the table that I exported, it's got a value of 3. And then you look at that, okay, the raster value is 3. And then you drill down, you take a close-up look. And if you're familiar with the landscape, you can tell what's going on here. So this is, you look at the elevation, it's estimated at 2.5 kilometers as Digital Globe is estimating it. So that would be equivalent of about 7,000 to 8,000 feet above ground level if you were flying a plane. So you can see that these are all shrubs. That's probably mesquite, acacia, we don't know exactly what it is, but it's shrub-covered grassland. It's estimating a value of 3 is what the classification did. And from my experience, I would say, yeah, that would fall in the greater than 20% cover of shrubland. So I ended up with accuracy of 53%, I guess that's all right. It's hard to really say. It's quantitative, but slightly subjective as well. So then once I have all this data, it's time to put it all together and create the corridor. And so I used a tool in ArcGIS that builds models, and it's called Model Builder. And so you put all these processes in, and it does them in a sequence so that you can change those variables and parameters, such as 1984 Landsat cover. You switch that to 2014 to get a different result. Finally, it spits this out. Here's your corridor. This is actually 3 corridors stacked on top of each other. But let's get right into the results. And by the way, the white-sided jackrabbit is not the only threatened species down there. Pretty much all grassland species are having a very difficult time. And the black-footed ferret is endangered, and this is living in a black-tailed prairie dog colony, which is down by Janos. And there's actually a biosphere reserve that's internationally known for that. So here's our first classification, which is 1984. If you look at these rings, these are 4.6 kilometers around a white-sided jackrabbit record. 4.6 kilometers is 3 times the size of a home range for this species. And so basically I just did some estimations, says, okay, to be safe, let's expand that area out, because these are probably populations and we want to at least encompass what's there. Here's 2014. So now we start comparing these two, and it's changed, and shrub cover has increased dramatically by about 303% from 1984 to 2014. And you can really see that with all the red. So the red is indicative of heavy shrub cover. And you can see a lot of the green has really disappeared. And this corresponds to a lot of the publications and data that we know of here in the Southwest. Here's the 1984 corridor. Now, if you look at that corridor, all of the records for the white-sided jackrabbit are making contact with this corridor, leading all the way up to the Animas Valley. The only one that's not is that one, and also one up there. But that was because those were not included in that raster. They were outside of the 2 origin points that you're trying to connect. Here's the 2014 corridor. You can see a pretty dramatic decline. There's only about 10% of that left. There they are superimposed on each other. But let's take a look on the ground of what is happening. Because from this is all theoretical, but we'll take a look in this close-up here. Okay, note this triangle right here. These are farm fields, but what is interesting to note is look at the structure of them. They're long, they're straight, nothing dramatic, probably family farms or ejidos that are doing small-scale farming. You don't see anything really major happening. Here's 2014. We've seen an explosion of center pivot agriculture. Picture's worth 1,000 words, and here's the 2014 corridor running through there. Now, corridor wants to find a way to get there. That's its job, is to find a corridor no matter what. Don't come home until you find a corridor. Well, it's trying to wiggle through here. See, it found a way to just kind of make its way through there, but that's probably not realistic that, because the rabbits don't have the luxury of an aerial view to plan their route. So there's the 1984 corridor on top of that. Well, it's heavy-duty agriculture. This is the Mennonite settlements, which have really proliferated in that area in the last 30 years. We've got a lot of overgrazing. If you can guess which side is the overgrazed side, you get a prize, but that's a pretty severe fence line photograph. And then just the gradual increase of shrub cover that is happening in the grassland. This is actually a Ephedra trifurca, which is invading this area. So, in conclusion, we looked at the process of classifying satellite imagery. We saw that significant changes have occurred in land cover since 1984. And as a result of this change, the migration corridor has narrowed for the white-sided jackrabbit. And it's not likely that there is connectivity. So I don't know what to do, but all we can do is hope for the best.